My old heart thundered. Sweat dripped into my eyes, momentarily blurring the cracked targeting display. I wiped it away with a trembling hand, the acrid odor of machine grease and fear thick in my nostrils. My breath rasped harshly inside the cramped, oily confines of the old battle tank, my metal tomb. It had always been this way. The rattling cacophony, the dizzying whirl of the rusted turret, the nausea churning in my guts as we lumbered forward. But back then, there had been camaraderie. The rough laughter of my brothers in arms. Our shared gallows humor cutting through the stench of propellant and diesel. Outside, the shriek and bang of alien weaponry was relentless. It had been relentless for days, now. They'd taken the city within hours, monstrous biomechanical war machines scything through our defenses. We humans. We never stood a chance. Those of us still breathing were nothing but rats in a maze now. I was old even back when the invasion began. Decades of hard living and grueling military service had left my body a scarred roadmap of aches and pains. My reflexes were shot, my aim less than steady. But after the initial shock, when the survivors among us realized what faced us, well, old soldiers knew our duty. That first week, they'd stripped the museums bare. Every mothballed tank, every relic from wars thought long over, was dragged back into desperate service. Crews were cobbled together from whoever had even the faintest notion of how these beasts operated. Old-timers like me, reservists, even civilian enthusiasts who'd tinkered on old war machines as a hobby. My tank, the old girl, was a relic of a bygone era. A behemoth of steel and fury built on the bones of another war, a war humanity waged on itself. My crew was eclectic. Wynne was a baby-faced kid barely old enough to shave. Eyes huge, hands shaking when he wasn't feverishly cramming shells into the breech. Garcia was even older than me, a retired history professor who'd once lectured on these very machines. Now he was my gunner, squinting through the chipped sights, murmuring under his breath like he couldn't quite believe it was real. I wouldn't have blamed any of them for deserting when they saw how outmatched we were. I wouldn't have thought less of them. But they didn't. Something about these lumbering rust buckets, something about their obsolete brutality, seemed to spark a stubborn kind of courage in them. A sort of pathetic, beautiful defiance. We rolled out of our makeshift motor pool, a ragged parade of mismatched machines. Our mission wasn't glorious. No heroic last stand. We were bait, a distraction. We needed to make enough noise, cause enough mayhem, to give the civilian evacuation more time. It was a fool's errand, a desperate gamble, and we all knew it. The aliens had barely even noticed us at first. Their insectal war machines, gliding on fields of crackling energy, regarded us with what seemed like indifferent amusement. A lion might do the same, watching a toddler brandishing a stick. Then, we opened fire. The old girl roared. My ears, already half deaf from a lifetime around big guns, rang with fresh abuse. The main cannon bucked, the shockwave reverberating through my bones, but the ancient projectiles found their mark. One of the alien machines staggered, glowing armor spider webbing with cracks. A second was peppered with our heavy machine guns, a rain of sparks against its force shield. That's when they turned to us, truly turned their attention to the gnats stinging them. Those multifaceted eyes, those insectal clicking noises that passed for their speech, there was surprise there. Maybe even a flicker of something like fear. They'd misjudged us. They'd thought these machines were mere museum pieces, that we were soft, technologically surpassed. They didn't understand the core of human warfare. It wasn't about elegance or clean efficiency. It was about raw, bloody-minded endurance. It was about spite. It was about a willingness to throw absolutely everything you have at the wall, even if the wall was bigger, stronger, and had lasers. And these ancient tanks, well, they were built for exactly that kind of fight. Crude, monstrous, stubbornly refusing to become obsolete. They were the cockroaches of war machines, designed to survive what nothing should be able to survive. The alien counterattack was swift and brutal. Energy beams sliced into my little convoy, armor melting like wax. One of our tanks vanished in a fireball, and I heard the screams of the crew cut short over the crackling comm channel. I swore, rage spiking like a fever. Garcia was working the gun, barking coordinates and corrections as if we were back at the firing range, not in a world ending around us. The old professor was built of sterner stuff than he looked. Wynne, bless him, was sobbing now, but his hands never stopped loading. Tears streamed down his face, a surreal sight amidst the grime and fire licking at the hatch. If we'd had time, I'd have comforted the boy, but we were long past that. All we could do was fight. The aliens pressed. One of their war machines closed the distance, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it would simply ram right through us. But the old girl had one last trick, one last Defiance surprise left. I hit the detonator. The hardwired explosives we'd rigged to the tank detonated. It was a final, middle finger salute. We weren't going to let them take this rusting hunk of iron and fury intact. Not one bolt of her would serve the invaders. The shock blasted our tank backward, and through the whirlwind of smoke and flame, I saw the alien machine go reeling. Its shields flared wildly as the ancient explosives wreaked havoc, buying us a precious few seconds. Or that was the plan. But the world lurched sickeningly, the old girl tipping onto her side. My vision went dark as I tumbled inside the turret, pain exploding in my ribs. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Wynne scream, Garcia shout something. Then silence. I drifted in and out of that darkness. There were no more alien sounds, only the eerie quiet of aftermath. Something wet trickled into my mouth, blood, I realized dimly. I tried to move, to see if the others were okay, but my body refused. My tank had become my coffin after all. Death felt anticlimactic. A fading away amongst the cold oily steel. But at least we'd made a difference. We'd bought those civilians more time. That had to count for something, didn't it? Then came that new sound. Not the guttural clicking of the aliens, but a deeper rumble. It was a noise I vaguely recognized, one that sent a shiver of dread through me. The rumbling grew louder, and it was joined by metallic clanks, and voices. Human voices, speaking English. Over here. Holy Sarge, you're not gonna believe this. My dimming vision flickered back on. Light was stabbing down into the interior of my tank, harsh and blinding. Rough hands were tearing at the twisted metal, pulling the hatch out of its mangled frame. My breath hitched. The faces hovering above weren't civilian. These were soldiers, clad in unfamiliar armor. But the flag emblazoned on their shoulders, that I knew. Are you alive in there? A shout, edged in a disbelief that bordered on reverence. I was old, I was broken, but I suppose I wasn't quite done yet. I managed to croak out what I hoped was a convincing affirmative. There was a flurry of action then, medics swarming down into the greasy confines of the tank. Pain lanced through me as they cut me free from the wreckage. Above, another voice cut through the chaotic symphony of a battlefield. What the hell museum did they pull these tanks out of? I couldn't see the face of whoever asked that question. But his tone, the strained disbelief laced with a wild sort of hope, well, I recognized that. It was the voice of a man who'd been staring into the abyss, only to see the abyss blink back. They patched me up as best they could, right there in the field. Battlefield medicine wasn't gentle, but I'd seen worse. The questions, though, it was a different kind of assault. How long ago did you activate? Where are your support elements? Your command center? What's the tactical situation on the perimeter? My responses, a bewildered croak of what year is it? Did little to reassure them. They thought I was concussed, shell-shocked. Hell, maybe I was. But as the haze began to clear, I could see the same impossible expression mirrored on their faces, and or tinged with incredulous hope. They got me back to what passed for a field hospital, a hastily erected tent city buzzing with grim-faced activity. Once again, I was poked, prodded, patched up, and then interrogated in a series of increasingly high-tech briefing rooms. Each new officer up the chain of command looked at me like I was some unearthed relic, an anachronism that had no place in their world. It took hours, and what felt like half my blood supply, before they finally began to believe the unbelievable truth. It wasn't any brilliant argument on my part that turned things. It was simply the hard, cold data that couldn't be faked. My dog tags, with dates so far in the past they might as well have been in hieroglyphics. The primitive datapad they found tucked into my old uniform, its memory banks containing basic targeting coordinates, names of my dead crew, and a hastily scrawled last will and testament. News of my existence spread through their ranks like wildfire. Soldiers started looking at me strangely, a combination of morbid curiosity and something close to reverence swirling in their eyes. I was a ghost, a legend given flesh. An old soldier from an unwinnable war, somehow spat out into their time. They had a name for what had happened. A temporal anomaly. Apparently, whatever cataclysmic energy those alien machines used to open up invasion portals had caused unpredictable ripples in the fabric of time itself. I was flotsam, washed up on the shores of the future. Wynne and Garcia, presumably, were not so lucky. The revelation that the present day was centuries beyond anything I knew, that humanity was still clinging to survival against an apparently relentless enemy. It was a blow both bitter and surreal. To outlive your friends, your world, to be a relic before your time? It was a strange sort of sorrow. But the soldiers, these hardened future people with their sleek guns and augmented eyes, weren't the types to dwell on grief for long. Or maybe, they'd learned to bury it deep under sheer necessity. Once the shock wore off, they looked at me and they saw not just an out-of-time oddity, but a weapon. It turned out, humanity had pushed the invaders back, even developed some counter-tech that leveled the playing field, somewhat. But it was a grinding, bloody stalemate. The war had settled into a long slog of attrition, inches of territory gained and lost at a terrible cost. Earth was a patchwork of defended zones and scorched no-man's lands. And in their desperation, they saw something in my rumbling, obstinate tank, saw something in me. I was an echo of what they called the old wars. The era before humanity ascended to the stars, when we tore each other apart with a kind of single-minded brutality they desperately needed now. They laid out the situation with stark efficiency. There was a heavily fortified alien forward base, a nexus point for their operations in the sector. Hitting it hard, hitting it right, could disrupt their whole supply chain. It would be a risky as hell gamble, the kind of fight where you'd be lucky to scrape out alive even if you won. Humanity, it seemed, wasn't above a little suicidal bravado when it was needed. Their tanks were marvels, sleek, fast, armed to the teeth with lasers and energy shields. But they lacked a certain weight. They were precise weapons, scalpels to my sledgehammer. And what these future warriors needed now was brute force, something that could punch through alien defenses and hold ground under withering fire. They'd found more of our old relics, a whole hidden cache of mothballed tanks. Now they wanted to know everything I could tell them: tactics, formations, doctrine, the way we handled things back when wars were fought in the mud and blood, not the clean void of space. I became part strategist, part living museum exhibit, teaching grizzled, high-tech soldiers lessons from a century-dead battlefield. There was a dark humor in it, showing these descendants of ours how to wage a war the old-fashioned way. But something churned in my gut too, something like pride. Those ancient machines, those primitive tactics, hadn't been made obsolete by the passage of time. They embodied a human spirit that wouldn't be extinguished, a stubborn refusal to go quietly into the night. They prepped the old girl, as best they could. The centuries hadn't been kind, even in storage. She sported hastily welded armor patches and power systems cobbled together from what must have been half a dozen different vehicles. I knew some of the techs looked at our rattling column of resurrected war machines and were sure we'd get ourselves killed before we even reached the forward base. But some, the ones with the 1,000-yard stare of people who'd seen too much, had a spark in their eyes. A desperate, hungry sort of hope. We rolled out under the cold light of alien moons. I knew this might be my last ride, but I wasn't afraid anymore. If nothing else, maybe I'd remind this future version of humanity of the kind of fight their ancestors had in them. Maybe I could ignite a reminder that sometimes, survival demanded getting down and dirty, embracing the monster. The forward base was a blight on the landscape. Its towers hummed with strange energies, and alien fighters zipped around it like angry insects. I couldn't fathom how they managed to establish this kind of foothold, but I didn't need to. All I needed to do was break it. Those sleek future tanks took point, their lasers peppering the outer defenses. We lumbered behind, holding our fire, conserving our fury for what came next. Even through the haze of time, I knew this dance. Cover fire, suppress, then break through. Classic. Energy beams whizzed past my turret with an eerie whistle, and alien return fire hammered into our hastily built-up armor. One of our resurrected tanks brewed up in spectacular fashion, and I flinched despite myself. But this time, there was no time to grieve. Only to push on. Then, that moment that every tanker lives for. We broke through. It was chaos incarnate, lasers and explosions and roaring engines. My trigger finger ached from firing that ancient cannon, Garcia's horse targeting coordinates ringing in my ears despite him being long dead. And through it all, the rattle and roar of the old girl, her protest against her own obsolescence. The aliens seemed confused at first, probably unable to match the signature of our lumbering forms to anything in their database. Then came a grudging sort of respect, if the focused fire we drew was anything to go by. We were close enough now for our machine guns to rake across their emplacements, to spit hot, solid fury the way they were always meant to. It wasn't elegant. It was messy, brutal. And gods, it felt good to be part of that mess again. An alien command bunker loomed ahead. One well-placed shot, right into the midst of those crackling energy fields, and the whole structure might go up like a firecracker. I signaled the others to fall back, to give me some space. They knew the drill, knew what we old-timers did when the odds demanded it. Maybe I was being sentimental. Maybe, deep down, I wanted to go out fighting the way I always had. One last blaze of glory. In any case, we didn't have time to argue about it. I jammed my foot down on the accelerator. The old girl lurched forward, engine protesting, and I aimed her squarely at the bunker. Here goes everything, I thought. For win, for Garcia, for a world that doesn't exist anymore, for a fight that probably won't be won, and for the crazy hope that maybe, just maybe, it all meant something. I wasn't sure if I blacked out right before impact. There was a teeth-rattling jolt, a flash of blinding light, and a screaming roar that was the world ending, or maybe just me. When the ringing in my ears faded, I was alive. And unbelievably, mostly in one piece. The old girl, well, she was in even worse shape than before. Her treads were snapped, her hull cratered, and half her guns were just melted slag. Through cracked viewports, I could see the alien bunker imploding in on itself, a cascading eruption of alien tech gone haywire. But so was everything else. The air crackled with a strange energy, and the very ground seemed to ripple under my boots. That's the thing about temporal anomalies, they aren't known for their stability. Then the aliens attacked. Not in an organized, kill the intruders kind of way. Their lines were in disarray, their formations broken. They were running, scuttling for cover, just as panicked as we were. One of their insectal war machines came crashing out of the swirling dust, its once gleaming carapace pitted and scarred. It turned its multifaceted eyes on me, the tank that had defied it, that should be long destroyed. And I swear, the look on its compound eyes was one of utter terror. Then it turned and fled, scuttling on its spindly legs into the swirling energy storm. The war, seemed to melt away. The energy storm intensified, washing out the sun and churning up a maelstrom of debris and light. My fellow soldiers, the sleek future warriors who'd looked to me for salvation, were in full retreat, shouting panicked orders amidst the howling vortex. My instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, in a flash of brilliance, I understood. It wasn't the old tanks that were pivotal, not our tactics, not even our stubborn grit. It was the temporal anomaly itself, destabilized beyond anything the aliens, or we, could control. Just as it had spat me into this future, it was now unraveling. Whatever thread of misaligned time had brought the invaders to this version of Earth, it was fraying, snapping back in a backlash as destructive as their arrival. Maybe they'd never even meant to come here, to this epoch. Maybe they'd been caught in the same backlash that had thrown me forward, victims, like me, of technology they didn't fully understand. Or maybe, none of that mattered. I was going back to my time, my war, and the oblivion awaiting me there. It was far from the glorious last stand I might have imagined, but it felt strangely right. I clambered back into the crippled tank, every movement an excruciating protest from my battered body. The controls were a maddening mix of archaic and futuristic, but I found what I needed. The manual override for the turret. With trembling fingers, I brought the main gun to bear, not on any alien target, but on the swirling heart of the energy storm itself. One last shot, not from a soldier at a foe, but from a tired, old man at the indifferent workings of the universe. I closed my eyes as I pulled the trigger. The roar of the gun was lost in the howling maelstrom, the recoil a mere vibration in the fabric of a disintegrating reality. And then, darkness. Silence. When I came to, I was splayed on the greasy floor of my old tank, the familiar scent of oil and cordite thick in my nostrils. Birdsong drifted in through an open hatch, and warm sunlight dappled the cracked glass of the viewports. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that moment, I couldn't tell if I was seconds away from getting vaporized by an alien invasion force, or if none of it had ever happened. It felt like both things might be possible. Then came the rumble of heavy vehicles, and the harsh shouts of men, my men, speaking in the rough slang of a vanished age. My tank was surrounded, not by sleek future warriors, but by soldiers clad in dusty, mismatched uniforms that were achingly familiar. I staggered out into the harsh sunlight, blinking like a mole dragged out of his hole. A grizzled sergeant, his face a map of scars and exhaustion, peered up at me. "The hell you been, soldier?" he bellowed. "Thought we lost you when Garcia bought it. We got a push coming. Get your relic moving, and let's show these bastards what real war looks like." And that's exactly what I did. Because whether this was the calm before the alien storm, or a second chance I didn't deserve, only time would tell. And until then, well, there was a war to fight. I slotted back into my old tank crew like a rusted gear finally finding its teeth. The fear and awe of those future soldiers melted away, replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion and grim camaraderie of men bound by the certainty of imminent violence. It felt morbidly comforting. Those first few days were a blur. We pushed forward, taking back ground lost during my absence, a motley parade of mismatched machines against what we all now assumed was a horde of invaders accidentally flung into the wrong era. The aliens, disoriented and out of place, still fought with terrifying ferocity, but there was a fractured quality to their defense, a sense of desperation creeping into their inhuman screeches. My ears ached for the crackle of a comm unit, the precise targeting coordinates relayed by a command center. Instead, we relied on runners, on hand signals, and on the gut instinct honed over 100 nameless battlefields. It was, my eternal shame, how I felt most alive. Each time I peered through my chipped viewports, each time the old girl's engine roared and she lurched forward, there was a dark satisfaction. This I knew. This was what I was built for. There was no word from the outside world. Our little sector of rolling hills and shattered towns felt like the whole of existence. We heard rumors, whispered in the brief lulls between battles, about other pockets of resistance pushing back. There were stories of old planes dragged out of museums taking to the skies, of ships long thought obsolete creaking back into action. It seemed the shock of the invasion had jolted our world back to its senses, had ignited a primal defiance. Whether it would be enough, I didn't know. But the fight, the bloody, desperate, against all odds fight, that felt achingly familiar. Then came the day that changed everything. We'd spent hours hammering an alien stronghold, a twisted spire of alien metal that had sprouted up on the ruins of a once quaint village. Just as we were about to pull back and regroup, a flicker of movement caught my eye. It wasn't an insectal war machine, and it wasn't one of the refugees we'd occasionally encountered fleeing the chaos. This figure moved with upright, two-legged purpose. And it was heading straight for the spire. "Hold your fire," I barked into the crude comm system, a gnawing unease settling in my gut. Through the viewports, I made out the figure more clearly. It was impossibly tall, almost impossibly thin, encased in shimmering plates that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a featureless, mirrored helm. The alien defenses reacted, energy beams lashing out. But this figure didn't fall. It weaved through the deadly lights with a strange, liquid grace, never breaking its stride. It reached the base of the spire and raised its arms, the gleaming plates shifting as it did. There was a blinding flash, a surge of energy that made my teeth ache. I threw up an arm to shield my eyes, and when I dared to look again, the spire was collapsing in on itself, alien tech shorting out with ear-splitting shrieks. The otherworldly figure stood unharmed amidst the cascading debris. It turned then, its mirrored helm seeming to fixate directly on my tank. A jolt of fear shot through me, a primal sense of being watched, dissected. And then, the most impossible thing happened. It spoke. The voice wasn't transmitted over any channel I could recognize, yet it echoed directly in my skull, a cold, melodious whisper that bypassed my ears altogether. "We have much to discuss, Relic. Your war, it echoes ours." The figure turned and vanished into the shimmering air with the same uncanny fluidity that had marked its arrival. My crew gaped at me, and all I could do was echo their stunned, unnerved silence. Because if this was a rescuer, an unexpected ally sent by some unknowable power, well, it didn't feel like one. It felt like the start of an entirely new kind of nightmare, one that might make even those insectal alien invaders seem like a familiar enemy by comparison.